The elevator dinged on the 42nd floor, and I stepped out, heels clicking against the polished marble like a warning. Midtown never slept, they said, but this floor felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. The hum of fluorescent lights stretched across the hall, punctuated by the soft, steady murmur of early morning conversations. The faint scent of roasted coffee lingered in the air, grounding me, yet teasing me with familiarity I wasn't sure I wanted. I paused at the threshold of the office, eyes scanning the sea of glass partitions and sleek desks. Blackstone Dynamics was a tower of ambition, each office a microcosm of strategy, ego, and silent battles. My reflection in the glass seemed taller, sharper than I remembered, and for a moment, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Tamara, poised, confident, fully aware of the battlefield she had just entered. Redwood's name floated through my mind. CEO, titan of corporate maneuvering, a man who inspired respect and fear in equal measure. Today, I would not just observe. Today, I would stake my claim. But subtly, no reckless moves, not yet. I walked past the reception, nodding to familiar faces. Some returned the gesture with genuine warmth, others with careful calculation. In this place, everything was measured, every smile was a negotiation, every glance a calculation. My fingers brushed the strap of my bag, adjusting it with deliberate precision. A silent reminder to myself: control is perception, and perception is power. I found my office, tucked in a corner with a panoramic view of the city's veins of steel and light. Sitting down, I let the quiet hum of the space wash over me. This was my vantage point, my temporary calm before the storm of meetings and decisions. I could hear voices from the conference room drifting through the thin walls, discussions laced with ambition and tension. I imagined Redwood stepping in, the subtle shift in energy that always followed him. Anticipation prickled my skin. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Eyes are watching. Tamara, don't ignore the subtle cracks. I stared at it, letting the words sink in. No fear, only clarity. This was the kind of place where silence could kill, where whispers carried more weight than proclamations. Every action, every choice, every glance could ripple into consequence. I folded the phone neatly, returning it to my bag. Knowledge, observation, and restraint would be my armor. I walked toward the conference room, each step measured, deliberate. The click of my heels echoed off the marble, a staccato rhythm marking my entrance. Colleagues glanced up briefly, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. I allowed a faint smile, letting them wonder if I felt the pressure. I didn't, not yet. The conference room was alive with muted energy. Charts, projections, and polished presentations littered the table. The air smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. Redwood's chair remained empty at the head, an unspoken command of authority even in absence. I took my seat strategically, eyes roaming, noting the subtle alliances forming, the unspoken tensions dancing just beneath polite nods and surface-level cooperation. Minutes stretched, conversations weaving around me, layered with meaning. I listened, absorbing every phrase, every inflection, every micro-expression. Some spoke with genuine intent, others with careful omission, each sentence a coded message in the daily chess match of corporate survival. I made mental notes, catalogued personalities, tendencies, and hidden motivations. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth anchor me. Observation wasn't passive, it was an act of power. Every detail mattered, and in the subtleties lay the advantage. This room, this floor, this entire office, wasn't just a workplace, it was a stage, and I had just stepped into the spotlight, ready to perform the part that demanded resilience, intelligence, and strategy. Then, as if summoned by the tension in the room itself, the door opened. Redwood entered, every head turned, the air shifted subtly, the energy tightening like a drawn wire. He moved with quiet authority, commanding respect without a word. I met his gaze briefly, steady, unwavering, letting him register that I was present, capable, and alert. He nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Not approval, not yet. As he took his place at the head of the table, I exhaled slowly. Today wasn't about confrontation. It was about presence, awareness, and the silent gathering of information. The boardroom was a battlefield disguised in polished veneers and polite conversation. And I was armed with insight, composure, and the certainty that I could navigate it. The meeting began. Charts were discussed, numbers dissected, proposals scrutinized. I spoke when necessary, each word chosen for precision, each sentence designed to demonstrate competence without overexposure. Subtle power plays unfolded around me. Colleagues testing boundaries, probing weaknesses. I responded with the quiet authority of observation, answering when required, listening always, cataloging every reaction. By the time the meeting adjourned, I had a mental map of the floor's current dynamics, who wielded influence, who harbored hidden agendas, and who might become an unexpected ally. Walking back to my office, the hum of fluorescent lights now felt less menacing and more like the rhythm of a challenge I was prepared to meet. Sitting back at my desk, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Tamara, the black woman who had navigated countless obstacles to arrive here, now stood ready for the subtle, intricate games of corporate life. Observation, patience, and strategy would guide me. Knowledge was power, silence a tool, and restraint a weapon. Tomorrow, the real moves would begin. But today, I had arrived, unshaken, and fully aware of the storm that awaited. The afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long streaks of gold across the polished marble. From my desk, I watched Midtown pulse with its relentless rhythm, taxis weaving, pedestrians hurrying, neon signs flickering to life. The city moved fast, unyielding, but inside Blackstone Dynamics, another rhythm existed, slower, careful, and far more dangerous. I reviewed the notes I had taken during the morning's meeting. Each person, each alliance, every subtle jab or compliment, catalogued, dissected, and filed away. I could feel eyes lingering on me, though I didn't look up. In this environment, perception was currency, and I intended to spend mine wisely. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Tamara, got a minute? I looked up to see Julian, a colleague from another department. He was lean, always impeccably dressed, and carried an aura of quiet intellect. He smiled, the kind that didn't fully reach his eyes. That subtle hesitation, almost imperceptible, told me he had something on his mind. Of course, I replied, standing to let him in. He shut the door carefully, leaning against it as he spoke. I just wanted to check in, see how you're settling in. People can be, well, unpredictable. I nodded, choosing my words. I'm aware, but I've always believed it's better to watch than react. His eyes flickered, scanning my expression for cracks. Right, just keep your guard up. There's been some shifts. People aren't always what they seem. I allowed a faint smile, letting him think he'd unsettled me. I hadn't, not yet. Thank you for the advice, Julian. I'll keep it in mind. He lingered a moment, then excused himself, leaving the subtle tension behind. I exhaled slowly. Observation wasn't passive, it was an art form. Every conversation, every casual warning, every offhand comment carried weight. In this place, even allies could mask motives. The next hour passed in a blur of emails, reports, and conference calls. I noticed small things. A glance exchanged between two colleagues that lingered a beat too long. The quiet repositioning of papers just before a manager walked by. The sudden silence when someone mentioned Redwood's upcoming evaluation. Each detail was a thread, waiting to be woven into a pattern. By mid-afternoon, I felt the first prickling sense of suspicion. A memo had been circulated, innocuous in appearance, regarding project timelines and responsibilities. But the way certain names were emphasized, the subtle restructuring of duties, it wasn't random. Someone was testing waters, probing boundaries, and I intended to understand why before making my move. I leaned back in my chair, watching the room from my vantage point. This floor, this office, these people, they were a network of silent signals, and I was determined to decode them all. Around 3 o'clock, I ventured to the break room. The aroma of coffee was stronger here, mingling with the faint scent of pastries left from the morning. A small group gathered, talking quietly, almost conspiratorially. I caught fragments of conversation, numbers, deadlines, a mention of the upcoming review. I smiled faintly, refocusing on the pattern rather than the chatter. This was exactly the sort of human behavior that could be leveraged, if understood. I noted who spoke, who dominated, who stayed silent, and how each reaction shifted when someone entered or exited. Returning to my office, I received another message, anonymous again. Not everyone who smiles at you wants to see you succeed. I set the phone down carefully, letting the words settle. The message was more than a warning, it was confirmation. My instincts were right. Subtle tensions existed, alliances shifting beneath the surface. I would not confront yet, not openly. First, I needed the map, the layout of power and influence, the hidden currents. Late afternoon brought another encounter. Felicia, a senior manager known for her sharp mind and sharper tongue, appeared outside my office. Her presence always demanded attention, her reputation preceding her like a shadow. "Tamara," she said smoothly, "how's your first day going?" I gestured to a chair, inviting her in with a courteous smile. "Busy, observing more than anything else. It's a complex ecosystem here." Her eyes flicked around the room, appraising, searching for signs of weakness. "I can imagine. Just remember, some ecosystems are more dangerous than they appear. Watch your step." I met her gaze evenly. My calm deliberate, "I always do." She smiled, leaving with a subtle tilt of her head, a gesture that was equal parts acknowledgement and challenge. The unspoken message was clear. She knew I was watching, and she intended to test me. By the time the office emptied for the evening, I had compiled a mental dossier: who wielded influence, who maneuvered in shadows, and who could become an obstacle, or an ally. Each detail, each nuance, was a piece of a larger puzzle. As I packed my bag, preparing to leave, the city outside transformed. The streets glimmered with lights, reflections dancing in puddles from an earlier rain. Midtown's pulse never slowed, and neither would the currents within this office. I paused at the door, glancing back at the empty conference room. My reflection shimmered in the glass wall. Tamara, the observer, the strategist, the black woman who had learned long ago that survival required intellect and poise, stood ready. Suspicion was my weapon, patience my armor, and knowledge my shield. Tomorrow, the subtle games would escalate. The alliances, the rivalries, the unspoken challenges, all would become more pronounced. But I had the advantage. I had seen the threads forming, understood the currents, and begun weaving my own strategy. As I stepped out into the elevator, the familiar hum of the city below resonated through me. I was no longer merely present. I was aware, alert, and ready. Observation was not enough to survive here. But combined with strategy, discretion, and patience, it was more than sufficient to navigate this labyrinth of ambition and deception. The morning arrived with a muted chill, the kind that wraps around the city and whispers of unpredictability. Blackstone Dynamics lobby was bustling. The usual blend of hurried footsteps and low murmurs punctuated by the rhythmic clack of my heels as I stepped out of the elevator. I had spent the previous evening reviewing patterns, cataloging subtle behaviors, and mentally mapping the currents of influence on this floor. Today, observation alone would not suffice. I needed action, though carefully measured. I made my way to my office, my bag slung over my shoulder, my senses sharp. Every glance, every shuffle of paper, every hushed laugh carried meaning. I had started noticing micro shifts, small alliances forming in the periphery. Colleagues leaning subtly into conversations with one another. Whispers that disappeared when I entered a room. The office was a chessboard, and each person a piece. But few understood the rules entirely. By mid-morning, a situation presented itself, almost too conveniently. The project I had been assigned had been subtly reassigned. Not entirely, but enough to suggest someone was testing me, gauging how I'd respond to perceived disruption. Most would react with irritation or compliance. But I saw opportunity. I pulled out my notebook and began mapping the chain of influence: names, roles, tendencies, reactions. Every interaction in the office could be leveraged if approached with intention. My pen moved across the page like a scalpel, dissecting behavior, cutting away distractions, isolating motives. Felicia appeared at the entrance to my office. Again, this time, Her expression was inscrutable, a mixture of curiosity and calculation. "Tamara," she said smoothly, "I noticed the adjustments in your project. How are you finding the dynamics?" I met her gaze evenly. "Challenging, as any environment like this should be. But manageable. I thrive when there's movement, it keeps people honest." Her smile was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a flicker of a candle in a dark room. "Honest, huh? That's rare here." I let the comment hang between us, acknowledging it without concession. My advantage lay in restraint. A reaction could be exploited, silence, or carefully measured words, could be a shield. Later that morning, I strategically positioned myself near the communal printer, ostensibly to retrieve documents. From this vantage, I observed a conversation between two senior colleagues, Deshawn, known for his charisma but subtle manipulations, and Marlene, whose influence was quiet but pervasive. Their body language was deliberate. The tilt of a head, the subtle lean, the micro-expressions, they spoke volumes without uttering a single word meant for me. I jotted notes quickly, patterns emerging, alliances forming. Each observation became part of the strategy I was quietly assembling. In a workplace like this, power wasn't always official, it was whispered, implied, and demonstrated in the shadows. By noon, my attention shifted to the team email thread. Someone had subtly looped me into a conversation that was meant to gauge loyalty, to measure where I stood. A clever tactic, but transparent to anyone paying attention. I crafted my response with precision, neutral, informative, but assertive enough to establish my presence. The subtle maneuver was meant to assert my position without triggering overt confrontation. Lunch offered another opportunity. I joined a few colleagues in the cafeteria, taking care to engage selectively. Conversation flowed, but I observed patterns, the way voices rose and fell, how certain individuals dominated dialogue, and who remained silent yet visibly influential. Julian approached, carrying his lunch. "Mind if I join?" "Of course," I replied. As he sat, I noticed the subtle tension in the air. He wasn't just here for small talk, he was testing, probing. I mirrored his calm demeanor, allowing him to believe he had the upper hand. Subtlety, after all, was the currency of survival here. "You've been busy," he said casually, though his tone carried weight. "Seems like you're learning the ropes quickly." I smiled faintly. Observation teaches more than instruction ever could. You notice more when you're paying attention. His gaze lingered, almost measuring my resolve. I knew he was assessing how much I could see, how much I could anticipate. That was fine. Knowledge was the first layer of advantage. By mid-afternoon, the undercurrents began to shift. I noticed whispered adjustments in responsibilities, unspoken hierarchies asserting themselves. I began quietly initiating my own subtle maneuvers, small suggestions in meetings, carefully placed comments in emails, strategic acknowledgments that both pleased and challenged my peers. Each move was deliberate, a gentle test of the terrain. Around 4 o'clock, I received another anonymous message on my phone. "Trust is a luxury. Keep your allies close, and your instincts closer." I let the message linger, the words sinking in like cold rain. The subtle warning wasn't new, but the precision with which it arrived suggested observation. Someone was tracking me. That was expected. That was acceptable. My advantage lay in preparation, in anticipation, in the quiet cultivation of my own network of understanding. Felicia appeared once more at the end of the day. This time, her approach was direct, yet calculated, her tone almost conversational. "Tamara," she said, leaning casually against the doorway. "You navigate these waters well. But remember, currents can change without notice." "I know," I replied, maintaining steady eye contact, "and those who adapt, survive." Her smile flickered, a brief acknowledgement of my subtle challenge. "I'll be watching, always." As she left, I reflected on the day's observations. Alliances had shifted, power subtly realigned, and I had begun to trace the hidden structures of influence within this office. Each colleague had their agenda, and every interaction carried layered meaning. I closed my notebook, the page now dense with patterns, notations, and reflections. I had begun weaving my own subtle influence, aligning myself quietly with those whose values and intentions could complement my strategy. I had learned which whispers were worth listening to, which silences were deliberate, and which alliances could be leveraged when the moment came. The city beyond the window began to glitter as the evening settled. The pulse of Midtown mirrored the pulse of the office, a constant, relentless rhythm. I left my office with measured steps, aware of the eyes that lingered, the conversations that shifted when I passed, and the subtle currents that now bent in response to my presence. Tonight, I would plan, strategize, anticipate. Every small maneuver of the day was a lesson, every interaction a piece of the larger puzzle. Tomorrow, the game would continue, but this time, I would move with purpose, placing each subtle move with precision, shaping the environment in ways invisible to those who underestimated me. I pressed my palm against the glass of the elevator, feeling the tension hum through me. I wasn't just surviving, I was positioning, aligning, and preparing. The shadows of the office were no longer mere obstacles, they were tools. And I intended to wield them with intent, patience, and quiet authority. The first light of dawn hit the glass towers like an alarm I couldn't ignore. Blackstone Dynamics looked flawless, untouchable, but I knew the truth hiding in the polished corridors. Every step I took through the lobby echoed like a warning. Today wasn't just another day. Today, shadows would reveal who really moved the pieces, and who would get crushed. My heels clicked against the marble, a steady rhythm that barely masked the storm inside me. I wasn't just walking into work, I was stepping onto a battlefield. And I wasn't planning to leave empty-handed. Each face I passed, the receptionist with her forced smile, the janitor sweeping the floor as if he hadn't noticed me, reminded me that everyone here played a role. Some willingly, some, like me, out of necessity. I took the elevator up, the mirror reflecting my own resolve back at me. Tamara, 30 years old, black, and underestimated at every turn, was about to change the game. They didn't know it yet. They thought they were untouchable. They didn't know that for every slight, every overlooked talent, every whispered assumption about my abilities, I had built a file, a record of every injustice. And it wasn't just words on paper, it was power waiting to ignite. Stepping onto the 42nd floor, I inhaled the scent of strong coffee, paper, and ambition, so thick it felt like it could choke anyone without the right lungs. I passed cubicles filled with people who had learned how to survive here. Smiles carefully curated, eyes scanning for threats, alliances forming in silence. I wasn't just another player today. I was the storm they hadn't predicted. The morning meeting was already in session when I entered. Managers, directors, and executives clustered around the conference table, their eyes trained on charts and projections. But when they looked up at me, I saw that brief flash, the flicker of recognition that I wasn't who they thought I was. I could feel their tension, like a live wire humming across the room. Redwood, the VP who had underestimated me for years, was at the head of the table, exuding that calm arrogance that always precedes a miscalculation. He nodded politely, unaware that the balance of power was shifting. "I assume you've reviewed the Q1 reports?" he asked, his voice smooth, calculated. "I have," I said, letting my words carry the weight I had been building for months. "And I've noticed patterns that suggest a serious oversight in departmental accountability, oversights that, if corrected, could significantly improve efficiency and revenue." The room stiffened. The murmurs began. They hadn't expected this, not from me, not in this way. I continued, each sentence deliberate, measured, a mix of data and subtle provocation. I wasn't here to fight blindly. I was here to expose the cracks they thought were invisible. Every statistic, every chart, every anecdote I shared was a reminder. The empire they'd built on assumptions and privilege was not untouchable. Redwood's calm began to crack, just enough for me to see it. He leaned back, fingers steepled, a predator momentarily unsure of his prey. That hesitation was all I needed. By the time the meeting adjourned, the room felt different, charged, unsettled. Everyone knew something had shifted, even if they couldn't yet articulate what. And as I walked back to my office, the weight of that knowledge settled into my bones. I was no longer just surviving. I was orchestrating the change. The day ahead promised confrontation, calculation, and revelation, but for the first time in years, I felt the intoxicating clarity of control. Blackstone Dynamics had underestimated me. They had underestimated Tamara, and today, I would remind them exactly who I was, and what I could do. The tension in the hallway was thick enough to choke on. Every footstep I took echoed off the walls. But this time it wasn't just me moving. I could feel eyes on me. The quiet calculation of colleagues who had just realized I wasn't the timid, overlooked employee they'd dismissed for years. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at a storm they didn't see coming. I passed Derek, my team lead, who had once laughed at my proposal ideas. He looked up, a mixture of disbelief and respect flashing in his eyes. I nodded once, curtly. That nod wasn't friendship. It was acknowledgement. I was no longer playing their game by their rules. I was rewriting the board entirely. The conference room for the quarterly performance review was buzzing. Executives clustered around the sleek oak table, projecting confidence that thinly veiled tension. I entered, carrying my tablet loaded with months of research, meticulous notes, and the data I had painstakingly collected. Today, all of it would be weaponized. Tamara, Redwood said, his voice smooth but strained. I see you're early. Always, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. Time waits for no one. And neither does accountability. My words hit like a hammer. And I saw it. Just for a moment. The flicker of unease in his perfectly composed demeanor. I tapped the screen, bringing up my first slide. Charts, graphs, emails, memos. All lined up to tell a story Redwood had tried to bury under office politics and selective memory. As you can see, I began, my voice steady but charged with suppressed fire. There's a consistent pattern of misallocation and oversight across multiple departments. These are not small mistakes. They have cost the company millions. And they've been ignored or dismissed repeatedly. The room stiffened. Even the interns, usually glued to their devices, were now leaning forward, eyes wide. This was no longer just about numbers, it was about power, integrity, and who controlled it. Redwood cleared his throat, his attempt at authority faltering. I wasn't aware these issues had escalated to this level. I'm sure you weren't, I said softly, but each word carried steel. That's exactly why I'm presenting them now. Because awareness without action is just another form of negligence. The tension became almost palpable. Whispers buzzed like static electricity. I saw Linda, a senior manager who had quietly undermined me for months, shift uncomfortably. She knew that her name, linked to several of these oversights, would soon appear on the same slides I was cycling through. And then I did something they didn't expect. I paused the presentation, not because I needed a moment, but because I wanted them to feel it, the weight of realization. Their empire of control, carefully maintained, was vulnerable, and I was holding the blueprint of its exposure. Redwood leaned back, a mask of calm hiding the storm behind his eyes. Tamara, he said, voice tight, are you suggesting these failures are my responsibility? I didn't flinch. No, I said, letting the words sink in slowly. Deliberately, I'm suggesting that responsibility starts with leadership. And leadership starts with accountability. If we fail to act now, these patterns will continue, and the company will suffer. But if we act, we can redefine success, not for a few, but for everyone who has been overlooked or dismissed. A silence fell over the room. It wasn't the polite pause between statements. It was the charged stillness before a storm breaks. And I could feel it, every executive, every manager, everyone in that room, processing the fact that their carefully controlled world had shifted. I went slide by slide, meticulously exposing errors, showing how small oversights compounded into systemic failures. My data wasn't just numbers, it was stories. Emails with veiled threats, missed opportunities, even the subtle biases that had gone unchallenged. And with each revelation, I could see Redwood's composure cracking. Just a little more, like a porcelain vase under pressure. Finally, I reached the last slide. It wasn't numbers or emails. It was a roadmap, a plan for reform, accountability measures, and corrective action. I looked around the room. Some faces were shocked, some were defensive, Some, like Derek's, were quietly impressed. "This isn't about me," I said, letting my gaze sweep the room, holding each of them in a silent challenge. "It's about making sure the right decisions get made. It's about integrity, transparency, and, most importantly, justice for those whose work has been undervalued, dismissed, or ignored." The room was tense for another moment. Then, something shifted. A few heads nodded subtly. Others stared at their notes, silent but absorbing the impact of the truth I had laid bare. Redwood's voice came next, low and measured, trying to regain control, but I could hear the hesitation. "We will review these findings and take the necessary steps." I nodded, a faint, controlled smile touching my lips. "Good, because change isn't about promises. It's about action." As the meeting adjourned, the atmosphere felt different, charged, uneasy, and as I walked back to my office, heels clicking against the marble, I realized something vital. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I wasn't just an employee anymore, I was a force. A catalyst, someone who could make the powerful accountable. But the day wasn't over. I knew Redwood wouldn't let this go quietly. There would be whispers, subtle retaliation, attempts to discredit me. It was the game everyone played at Blackstone Dynamics. And I was ready, because for the first time, I wasn't just playing to survive. I was playing to win. In that moment, I understood the truth I had always known. In the corporate world, power isn't given, it's taken. And if you wait too long, it's gone before you even realize it. I returned to my desk, opened my laptop, and began the next phase. Emails, memos, strategic proposals. I wasn't just documenting change, I was engineering it. And every keystroke, every note, every calculated move brought me closer to the reckoning I had envisioned for years. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the office, I felt a surge of clarity and determination. Blackstone Dynamics had underestimated Tamara. They had underestimated the fire that burns when someone has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. And tomorrow, that fire would burn even brighter. I woke up that morning with a clarity that made the city skyline outside my window look sharper. Almost as if I could cut the air with it. Today wasn't just another day at Blackstone Dynamics. It was the day accountability stopped being a whispered threat and became an unavoidable reality. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. That delicious tension of standing on the edge before the leap. I arrived early, deliberately, to make sure everything was set. The conference room had been booked for a company-wide strategy session. But today, it was the stage for confrontation. I walked in, carrying a binder thicker than most of the corporate reports I'd seen. Filled with evidence, testimonials, and the outline of what would be a public reckoning. Colleagues filtered in, curiosity painted on their faces, gossip barely disguised in their polite smiles. Everyone knew something was different about Tamara today. I could see it in their posture. The way they whispered in corners. The subtle looks passed across tables. I had become the storm they didn't see coming. And then he walked in. Redwood. His entrance was calculated, confident, but there was a flicker, almost imperceptible, of doubt. A crack in the armor he spent years polishing. I caught it, and a quiet thrill coursed through me. "Good morning," he said, voice controlled, almost casual, but there was tension woven between the words. "Morning," I replied, setting my binder on the table with a definitive thunk. The sound was more than a noise, it was a statement. The room went quiet, all eyes were on me. I opened the binder to the first page, where a single word was printed in bold: accountability. "This is about more than numbers or missed deadlines," I said, my voice calm, steady, but carrying a weight that made people lean in. "This is about integrity, responsibility, and the culture we choose to uphold in this company. And for too long, the choices have been compromised by ego, fear, and the illusion of control." The murmurs started, subtle but noticeable. Redwood's jaw tightened. I didn't rush. I let the silence stretch, letting the tension seep into the walls like a living thing. I turned to the first piece of evidence, an email chain showing a pattern of favoritism, ignored mistakes, and subtle intimidation tactics that had been swept under the rug. The faces in the room shifted as they saw the reality of it. Managers who had thought themselves untouchable now squirmed under the scrutiny. Redwood spoke, carefully measured. Tamara, are you saying these issues are directly my doing? I looked him in the eye. Unflinching. I'm saying that leadership sets the standard. And when that standard is compromised, everyone suffers. You've had the power to fix this, to change the culture. And yet here we are, still fighting the same battles, still silencing the same voices. My voice didn't rise, but it carried the kind of intensity that made the room lean in closer. Colleagues who had once dismissed me now looked at me as if they were seeing someone completely new. I wasn't just Tamara anymore, I was a force of reckoning. I flipped to the next page, performance reports. Employee feedback, internal complaints, every piece carefully organized. Every thread connecting back to the failures at the top. Each slide, each document, was a nail in the coffin of the illusion that Blackstone Dynamics was untouchable. And then I paused. I could feel the electricity in the room. This was the moment where corporate politeness gave way to truth. I let Redwood speak, giving him the space to react, knowing he would try to reclaim authority. But the room was ready. Colleagues, once hesitant, now saw the clarity of what I was presenting. The interns, the mid-level managers, even some senior executives, they all felt the weight of what had been ignored for too long. Redwood finally spoke, voice tight. Tamara, this is a lot to take in. Are you suggesting an immediate course of action? I nodded slowly. I'm suggesting transparency, immediate accountability, a task force to address the structural failures that have been neglected. And most importantly, a culture where employees feel seen, heard, and protected. Change isn't optional, it's mandatory. The room was silent, but not the kind of silence that hides tension. It was charged. Expectant, ready for action. People were processing, absorbing the reality of what I had laid bare. The whispers had stopped. The subtle glances of doubt toward me had transformed into acknowledgement. And then, something shifted. Redwood's composure, carefully maintained for years, began to crack, not dramatically, not violently, but subtly. His eyes darted, searching for allies, seeking reassurance in a room that no longer offered blind loyalty. I could see the realization dawn. Tamara wasn't just challenging him. She had exposed the vulnerabilities of the system he had spent decades building. I closed the binder, the finality of the action echoing in the room. This is not a vendetta, I said, letting my gaze sweep the room. This is a turning point. We can either continue down the path of complacency, or we can choose integrity. The choice is ours, but it starts with accountability. Heads nodded, some cautiously, others with quiet determination. The energy in the room shifted from tense anticipation to focused resolve. People who had hidden behind protocol now had no choice but to confront reality. Redwood's voice was low when he finally responded. We will implement these changes. I will personally oversee the formation of the task force and ensure these issues are addressed. I nodded, a small, controlled smile playing at my lips. Good, because change without action is meaningless. As the meeting ended, I felt a surge of quiet triumph. I had done more than expose wrongdoing. I had created a moment of undeniable truth. The office would never be the same, and I would never be underestimated again. Walking back to my desk, I reflected on what had just happened. The fear, the tension, the anticipation, it had all been worth it. Not for revenge, not for ego, but for justice, for every colleague who had been ignored, dismissed, or silenced, for every voice that had been marginalized. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for all of us. By the time I sat down, the city outside had settled into its evening rhythm, lights glittering like fireflies, and inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The ripple I had started would grow, and those who had underestimated me would have to reckon with the truth. Because in this world, power is fleeting, influence is fragile, and Tamara was just getting started. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds in jagged lines, cutting across my desk like the edge of a blade. Today, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't just about accountability anymore, it was about visibility, justice, and leaving a legacy that no one could undermine. The conference room was packed. Not the usual corporate shuffle of chairs and polite greetings, but a congregation of people ready for change. Faces I had once seen avert their eyes now stared back with anticipation. Curiosity, even hope. They had come to witness a reckoning. And I intended to deliver it. Redwood entered last, attempting his usual air of control. But there was a tension. A hesitation. A subtle shift that told me he knew. Today. I held the narrative. I stepped forward, letting my presence fill the room. My heels clicked against the polished marble, each step a heartbeat in the rising tension. Good morning, I began, calm but commanding. Today isn't about me. It's about every voice that has been silenced, every opportunity that has been ignored, and every promise that has been broken under the guise of leadership. The room was silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning felt like it was holding its breath. I pulled the binder toward me and opened it to the first page. A comprehensive timeline of Redwood's mismanagement, negligence, and cover-ups. Each entry was annotated, verified, and impossible to refute. I let my gaze sweep the room, connecting with every pair of eyes, acknowledging the unspoken frustration, anger, and determination in them. This, I said, tapping the first page, is not a vendetta. It is a mirror. A reflection of what happens when leadership prioritizes ego over ethics, profit over people, and fear over fairness. Redwood's face tightened. I could see him searching for allies in the room, only to find neutral or supportive expressions staring back. The room had shifted. The power dynamics were no longer skewed in his favor. I moved through the binder like a conductor orchestrating a crescendo. Testimonies from employees who had been marginalized, overlooked, or threatened. Charts showing inequities in promotions and project assignments. Evidence of favoritism that had undermined not just careers, but trust in leadership itself. As I presented each piece, the room reacted, not with whispers, but with a palpable energy. A shared understanding that change was overdue. Murmurs of agreement, nods of recognition, even quiet exclamations of shock. Each reaction reinforced my certainty. The system could be held accountable. And justice was not only possible, it was inevitable. Redwood finally spoke, his voice strained, measured. Tamara, are you asking for full transparency? For systemic change? I looked directly at him. Unwavering. I am asking for a culture that values every individual equally. I am asking for accountability that transcends titles and tenure. I am asking for justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever felt invisible in this room. The room absorbed the words. I could see people exchanging glances, silently affirming the truth of what I said. The interns, the mid-level managers, even some senior executives, they all understood the weight of this moment. Then, I did something I hadn't planned. I invited Redwood to respond. Not with words, but with action. The next step, I said, voice steady, is not a debate. It is implementation. We will establish a task force. Audit all practices, and ensure that accountability isn't temporary, it becomes the standard. Leadership will be transparent, communication will be open, and culture will reflect the values we claim to uphold. The room shifted again, this time with a sense of resolve. People were no longer waiting, they were ready to act. They were ready to reclaim the narrative, to take ownership of the culture that had been neglected for too long. Redwood exhaled sharply. A subtle acknowledgement of defeat and acceptance. We will follow your recommendations. I will oversee the task force personally. Change will begin immediately. A quiet victory settled over me. Not a triumphant yell, not a smirk, but the deep, resonant satisfaction of knowing that justice had been enacted, and that it would ripple through the company long after this meeting ended. As people filed out, I lingered, allowing myself a moment to reflect. The fear I had once felt, the tension that had coiled in my chest for months, had transformed into empowerment. I had turned vulnerability into strength, frustration into action, and courage into change. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered on and the office emptied, I sat at my desk, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. Every slight, every doubt cast on my abilities, every whispered dismissal had fueled this moment. I realized something vital. The fight for justice and equity is not a solitary battle, it is communal. It thrives when voices unite, when courage is shared, when the truth refuses to be silenced. And for the community I stand with, my colleagues, friends, and everyone who has ever been told their voice didn't matter. This is the lesson. Your presence, your truth, and your courage are powerful enough to reshape the world around you. I looked around the office one last time. The hum of fluorescent lights now a soundtrack to my victory and the reckoning we'd forced. But this isn't just my story, it's our story. Every whisper, every unfair glance, every silent compromise, we've all felt it. And now, we have a choice: to stay silent or to rise. So here's my challenge to you. Right now, share this story. Speak up when you see injustice. Tag someone who needs to hear this. Comment your experience. Follow if you believe change starts with voices like ours. Every action counts. Every voice matters. Your courage can spark a movement. Your truth can inspire someone else to rise. We've proven that a single voice, when amplified, can shake the foundations. Don't just watch, join. Like, comment, share, and stand up with me. Together, we are unstoppable.